Okay, so I think we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone. In a moment, I'll share my screen, but just one brief, not to recap the actual content of what we said last week, but one of the ideas that I suggested for this mini shiur set of classes is very simply that we talk about gratitude journals as things typically that we would write and opportunities for us to reflect and think about things that make us grateful. And perhaps we can, just do a little bit of a twist and look at the Bible, look at our Tanakh, take individual stories and see what they have to tell us about gratitude. And as I mentioned then, but it bears repeating, to me, the goal is twofold. One is just to show how prevalent it is, right? How this is not just sort of a cutesy new age thought. This is something that's baked into countless stories in Tanakh. But secondarily, and I think more interestingly, is I've tried to select individual stories where each one will have an added nuance that will tell us something new, right? So instead of, and here's a story where so-and-so, brought home the homework for the classmate who was sick. Isn't that nice? And then the next story is someone brought home the, work product from the office. Isn't that nice, etc. Instead, to find really interesting and unique stories where we learn added nuances that we could use in both appreciating the stories that we're reading as well as in our own life. So without further ado, tonight we're going to talk about 3 stories and makes it a nice manageable amount. And let me just share my screen, and if you could all confirm just by nodding that you see it, I'm sure we're good. Perfect. Okay, so same cute image, but here's what I want to start with, right? We last week spoke a little about God on the various days of creation is creating and then saying this is good. Not going to repeat the aspects that we mentioned then, but we reached something very interesting on the 6th day, at least as understood by Chazal. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a second to make sure something else is working. It is. Okay, then back to the share. Okay, so what we read is Vayar Elohim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od vayar vayhi boker yom hashishi. Throughout, we've been having the phrase tov, which is good. And on this day, on the 6th day, God finds it very good. If you don't peek down here, I'll hide the screen, the bottom of the screen, right? If you don't look down, if you take things at face value, what is this saying, right? It's back to the report card days. You have a good column, a very good column, maybe the excellent column depends on us, right? But God, until now, it has been good, and now it's very good. Maybe it's the cumulative effect of everything that has happened until now. Maybe if we're anthrocentric, okay, because we were created, whatever it is, face value, shot would be, we've reached a moment where God says Tov Ma'od, and yet this is not at all how the phrase gets understood. So we will scroll down, and the first quote is from Breshit Rabbah, B'Torato shel Rabbi Meir, Matzu Katuv, V'hinei Tov Me'od, V'hinei Tov Mot, or Mavet, right? Behold, it was very good. Somehow this refers to death. We look at Breshit Rabbah a little further down, Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak's turn, and he says it refers to the angel of death, right? Similar permutations on that. If we jump a little earlier, we have a different comment. Very good is still not going to be what we would have said, but it refers to the Yetzer Hara, to the evil desire. So good refers to the Yetzer HaTov, our good angel on our proverbial shoulder, or on our real shoulder, but the proverbial image that we have. And then Yetzer Hara. What is going on here? So the Midrash, sorry, I'm scrolling up and down to hide certain things, but the Midrash is trying to make sense of it. And in at least one of the cases, I'm just choosing one of the examples, it says, how could it be very good? And many of us are familiar with this idea, with this story, that, you know what, there are good aspects, as we know in life, right? Traits have pluses and minuses. And this is the instance where we have an idea that without the evil desire, and what might evil desire refer to here in context, we'll get back to. Without evil desire, in quotes, no man would build a house, take a wife, and beget children, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the Midrash, in at least one of the cases, and maybe more, is trying to make sense of this, right? It's trying to say, how can we understand in the context of a Tov word, right? A very good Tov word. We thought it would be a positive emphasis. All of a sudden, we're suggesting that Tov Ma'od means something else. And so what the Midrash says here is referring to traits. I don't know, maybe it's the goal for grandiosity and accomplishment, right? Ozymandias. There are things that we want to be immortal, we want to live on. There are bad manifestations of that, but there are also good manifestations, right? This leads us to try to be builders. This leads us to have families, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to focus on so much the explanation that the Midrash gave, and we are going to see very soon what this has to do with gratitude and what we're talking about, and different ways to understand this Tov Ma'od, which creeps up and gets interpreted in ways that we would not have imagined. So here is the Gemara in Brachot on 54a. It says the same thing in different ways, so I'll skip the first. If I have any volunteer readers, please let me know and just either unmute yourself or raise your hand. And if not, I'm happy to forge ahead. Okay, looks like I'm going to forge ahead, which is fine, right? Chayav adam levarech al hara kishem shemavarech al hatova. We are obligated to actually make a bracha, right? To thank God, to bless the bad that comes in our lives. Kishem, we'll get back to the translation of that word, that we do for good, right? Quotes a pasuk, a verse, etc. And then it ends, davar acher bechol ma'odecha, bechol midah umidah shehu moded lecha have moda lo. Whatever God throws at you, whatever attribute, right? We're familiar with the Yud Gimel Midot Rachamim, but whatever attribute, even if it's not on the positive list, this is something for which we thank God. So, I doubt I'm alone in asking, how do we understand this? How are we thanking God for the terrible things that happen in our lives? And as part of that, I want to read the phrase in Hebrew again. Chayav just means we're obligated. Adam, man, woman, levarech, to bless, al hara'ah, for the bad. And then it says what? Kishem shemavarech al hatova. So we're making a comparison between what happens when good things occur and what happens when bad things occur. And there's this word kishem. And so how do we understand the concept at all? And how do we understand the word kishem? So what's very interesting is you see here one translation, the English that I grabbed from Sefaria. It's a very good translation. It says just as. But what I wanted to point out is, do you think, and I'll let the crowd answer if you're so inclined, right? Is this just descriptive that we are saying? It's also prescriptive. We're being told what to do, right? But is this Gemara giving us an indication as to why this might be so, or just that it is so, right? So if you translate and either what you see here, just as you thank God for the good, you thank God for the bad, that's a comparison, and I don't think it's telling us anything more about the rationale. We're as perplexed as when we started, potentially. There's another translation that's found in Jastro's Talmud Dictionary, and there he suggests that the phrase really means as well, like in case A, as well as in case B. And there too, I think that becomes just descriptive that we're saying, for whatever reason that we haven't yet touched on, you are giving bracha, gratitude. That's why we're talking about this now, just to bring that piece home, right? You are thanking God for something. There's an example of gratitude that is somehow going to make sense and apply even in our imperfect world, even when situations are bad. We are supposed to have gratitude. What does this mean? So here's a suggestion that you could take or leave in terms of adding some meaning to this Gemara. We're going to see two other ideas, but perhaps when we have this phrase kishem, which we've been translating until now as just as, or as well as, right? Situation A of bad as well as situation of good, or just as you praise God for the good, praise God for the bad. Maybe it means for the same reason, not just in the same way, not just in the same case, but for the same reason. And what that might mean, we know, I'm certainly not going to solve all the issues of theodicy in one part of one class, right? Nor do I think is this Gemara trying to do it. Chazal have multiple approaches on the topic. My father wrote a book on the topic. Chazal's approach overall seems to be that because we have multiple possible explanations, you might apply different ones in different cases and take the ones that resonate with you. But in this context, one of the explanations that we know that could sometimes help us when things are trying is what this idea that hopefully it's not as bad as it seems. Hopefully, if not Father knows best, God knows best, right? Maybe built into this phrase is, if we think God's really smart, when God listens and does exactly those things that we've told God that we need and that we want, then it's quite possible that God's also smart, and these other things that are occurring in our life that do not seem as clear, that do not seem as desired, are also from the same smart God who has what's best for us in mind. This, I think, lines up with that approach, which, again, it's not going to fit all situations, but that idea where you say, how does a good, all-powerful God allow something bad to happen? And at least in some instances, the answer is what? It's not bad. It might be that case where you missed the flight and then the plane crashed. Well, those ones are easy, right? That's where we get an immediate understanding of something that seemed bad being good. But perhaps this is built in to the kashem, tightening the connection between what we see. God is always doing the right thing for us, and sometimes it's obviously good and sometimes it's not. Well, if that's the case, that's one way that we understand how we could express gratitude, even for the, in this case, then we might put, the ra'ah, the bad, in quotes. So that's idea number one about this Gemara. And this is all, again, on the all-important idea for us of how are we expected to say gratitude when there are bad things in our life? How are we expected levarech to say a bracha? That's idea number one. Idea number two is the famous story of Reb Zusha. Now, there's more than one story, but in this case, I'll read the Reb Zusha. I'll describe it outside, and then I'll read some of the Reb Zusha story to which I'm referring. A chassid of Rav Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, comes to him with a question. And the question is about...
I'm listening, going to a class right now.
Sorry, whoever that is, if you could mute. So a chassid comes to the Maggid of Mezrich, and he asks a question, and he says, here's this Gemara, and he says, you know what? I could even buy not being mad at God. I could even understand accepting. Sometimes we need to accept what God wants from us, but And we're going to see, how did the Chassid translate this line? The Chassid understood this line to mean just as, on the exact same level. It seems like this Gemara is saying we have to be as happy, bless God, as much for the bad, for the ra'ah in our lives as we do for the good. That is just too much. Okay, so the Chassid's premise, it wasn't, not only did he not take Ari's new convoluted explanation of shame, but he's taking the just as translation very literally, whereas you might have just said, in the same way that you have, even as you could translate like Jastrow, you have to do it here as well as there, but God may not expect you to be, as excited or happy. But he takes a maximalist interpretation of this Gemara, and either way he goes, I don't get it. How could I do it? Right? Reb Dov Ber says, I'll tell you the answer. Go and see my disciple Reb Zusha. Only he could help you in this manner. Okay? So the Chassid does what a Chassid does, right? The Rebbe has told me to do something, I'm going to go do it. And so he goes, and he goes to the house of Reb Zusha. I'm going to read, Reb Zusha received his guest warmly, invited him to make himself at home. The visitor decides to observe Reb Zusha before asking anything. Okay? He's watching. Before long, he concludes his host truly, is unbelievable, and I get it. He is exemplifying this idea. I know why the Maggid sent me, meaning what? I'm watching, and this guy is suffering. He's a frightful pauper. There's never enough to eat, affliction, illness, you name it. Yet Reb Zusha is what? He's good-humored, he's cheerful, he's constantly expressing his gratitude to God. So this much he knows, right? He knows the Rebbe. It's not like a Schwarzer Wolf story or something we don't understand where someone seems difficult. The Rebbe really sent him to a tzaddik. He's observing amazing behavior from a person who fits the case we're talking about. This person, Reb Zusha, seems happy for all the bad in his life. And okay, check mark number one, I've observed, but what did the Chassid really want? The Chassid wanted to understand. So finally, after a few days, he poses his question to Reb Zusha. He says, I want to ask you something. In fact, this is the whole reason for the visit. This is why the Rebbe sent me to you. What is your question? Asked Reb Zusha. The visitor repeated what he asked of the Maggid. You raise a good point, said Reb Zusha, after thinking the matter through. But why did the Rebbe send you to me? How would I know? He should have sent you to someone who has experienced suffering. Okay, great story, even for those of us who have heard it before. And really, what's Reb Zusha's approach? And at first it will be probably, and maybe even not just at first, an approach that would be hard for us to take into our own lives. But Reb Zusha, why is he thanking God even though so much bad happens to him? It's not like our first answer that sometimes things that seem bad aren't bad. Reb Zusha doesn't even see the bad. Reb Zusha's like, what are you doing here with me? I have a great life, right? You should go find someone who knows from Tsaris. So, one approach of having gratitude is like, if you are lucky enough to have Reb Zusha rose-colored glasses, right? From now on, we'll call them Reb Zusha-colored glasses. You don't even see the bad. That's a way to do it. As the Talmud says in other cases, right? This may not be the way for the many. But I think there's a way to resurrect Reb Zusha in a smaller form, even for us. We sometimes talk about, choose to be happy and the aspects of which there's a choice. And so on a simpler level, what we could be saying is, choose what to look at. And maybe unlike Reb Zusha, we're going to notice that the rest is there. But, the more you focus on the good, the more the good is there and the more that's what you see. So that's the second approach to this Gemara that is essentially saying, be grateful, give bracha, thank God, express gratitude, even on the ra'ah, even on the bad. And finally, we have a third approach. It's a line I'm taking out of context, but it's still apropos, and I think it's helpful for us. It's the Ramban on our pasuk of Tov Ma'od, and in one place in his commentary, he says, you know what Ma'od means? Don't translate it as very, translate it as mostly, right? I think we could relate to that. So Tov Ma'od means mostly good, even though we know that there is also Ra'ah, whether that Ra'ah is evil inclination, whether that Ra'ah is death, whether that Ra'ah is hopefully something less dramatic for each of us, and the different small ways, again, hopefully that we suffer. Tov Ma'od, understand it as mostly. And since I was fond of explaining or suggesting interpretations of what kashem might mean. So a different way to twist it than we've said before is it might just be the recognition that things are a package deal, right? As in relationships, we know that sometimes you have to take the bad with the good. And in the same way that we're prepared to take the gifts that God gives us, okay, we could have gratitude. We understand that overall we're happy with the relationship. And even before we have the answers, that might be the shame. There's something I'm going to skip, but Michael, this one's for you. We'll talk afterwards. Someone asked me about faith and gratitude, and I made 2 suggestions below. For anyone who's interested, I'd be happy to share that, but one of those explanations in particular ties to something we just said. So anyway, let's skip that and go on to the second story, right? So the first story was what that we have on the 6th day of creation, Tov Ma'od, which, unlike the plain meaning we might have given it, actually means something about suffering in this world, and somehow we are supposed to still be grateful. And we mentioned 3 explanations. Explanation number 1 might be that idea that at least in some cases, what seems bad is not, and that might be built into the word kashem. The second idea was quite simply that if you're wearing Reb Zusha colored glasses, right, you don't even see the bad, but maybe in our case, we could still choose what to emphasize.
Yeah.
The third idea was, I think, a realistic one that a lot of us could relate to, using the Ramban's language that Tov Ma'od means things are mainly good. So why are you giving gratitude? Because things are mainly good, and we choose to focus on that, especially and selfishly, because we also know that gratitude benefits us. So this is part 1. This is our first story. And now I want to talk to you about Shabbat. So many explanations for why we keep Shabbat, but I'm going to share one of my favorites that I think relates beautifully to the idea of gratitude. So here is a summary that I wrote of an idea from Rav Nebenzahl at Yeshivat HaKotel. Right? He has the following idea, and I'll say some of it outside. Feel free to read the screen if you prefer. But what we're talking about is there are 2 opposite ideas. We believe that we are created in God's image, that the world is incomplete. Whether you use the phrase tikkun olam or something else, there's the idea of the word la'asot at the end of the pasuk that we're talking about. God created the world la'asot, and that there are things left for us to do. The la'asot is by us, right? This is an incomplete world, that we are here, not as playthings of the God, but we're here to improve the world, to perfect the world, to make the world better. But there is a downside if we only focus on that. If we constantly, in the same way that when you focus on gratitude, you see and live a life of gratitude. When they say you focus on the problem gets bigger, right? If we only focus on the fact that the world is incomplete, the good part is that we will be builders, and we will be focused, hopefully, on doing our part to complete the world. But we will still constantly be thinking about what? About lack, about privation, right? And so Rav Nebenzahl has this brilliant idea. And he says, you know what? It's really hard. We had mentioned this last week in passing. It's hard to, even in a nuanced, complicated brain, it's hard to hold the same idea at the same time, hold opposite ideas, excuse me, at the same time. And what he suggests is that we perform an exercise every week where on Shabbat we pause and say what? And this is obviously, pieces of it are 100% pshat. On Shabbat we pause and say what? Thank you, God, for creating a world that's pretty good. Thank you, right? That's Shabbat. We inherited this world and we thank God for it. And the rest of the week we say, okay, but I still notice the trim, the trim is not exactly aligned. The floorboard here is warped and we need to replace that. And so his suggestion is that Shabbat itself, if we put it into our terms, is about gratitude. It is about the fact that even though there's so much left that we can and should be doing, it is important for us to acknowledge all that we already have, and that is Shabbat. And that is how Shabbat is intrinsically tied to the idea of gratitude, as well as a counterbalance to what we're hopefully doing the rest of not only the week, but our lives in terms of working to make the world a better place. So one added sort of, not that Rev Nebenzahl needs my support, but I thought a fun way to relate to this phrase is we know that God has different names, and one of the names is Shaddai, God who says die. We know the word enough means literally enough, right? Stop. And we also know that the word enough, not so surprisingly, as we recognize from Dayenu and other places, relates to what? Being happy with what we have. It's enough, right? Humans, we're not always good at recognizing when we have enough. So in a very different technical context, but about Shabbat, we have an idea that God was creating, and midrashically, we say that God had to say die, that literally the only way creation stopped was that God used this word die. And so I am just suggesting that when God was using the word die, in line with everything else we were saying, God was using it not only as the abracadabra magic Harry Potter world that would make all the seething forces pause or complete, but also God was saying, even as, of course, God knew our continuing mission, God was saying, you know what, die, and it's good enough. And of course, understandably, again, on a pshat level, that is when someone's going to stop their job, right? God would still continue perfecting if it were not in a good enough state as to leave it then in our sometimes capable and sometimes incapable hands. But so this is the Shabbat story of gratitude. And I think it's profound and has a lesson for us, not only in understanding gratitude, but in balancing these different emotions, right? Balancing the things that we're grateful for and then the things that we still want and hope for. Any questions now before I hit the third and final story?
No.
Okay, great. So this one is called Persian punning. And so there is a well-known, intriguing Gemara that says as follows, Haman min haTorah minayin, what is the source for Haman in our Torah? And then it says in a play on words, Hamin ha'etz, right? Hamin sounds like Haman. Hamin literally meant, was it from the tree? And where was that statement, right? Adam and Chava had sinned. They realized that they were naked. They've started to cover up. God knows, of course, what has happened. And God reproaches Adam, and says, did you eat from that tree? Okay, so understandably, there are lots of fanciful Gemaras, but it's always better when we have a deeper connection and meaning going on. So what incarnation are we talking about, right? What is the significance of connecting Haman to this verse in the Torah? And so what we're going to do is we're going to briefly look at the story of Esther. It's timely, and this is, by design. And then we're going to go back to Bereshit and see what lessons we could take from it. And there might be some added thoughts that, again, I'm free to share offline, and the shul could connect us, or if you are friends or family of mine, you know where to find me. So let's start. Esther, the third chapter, Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela. Sorry, my mouse is a little too sensitive. Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela, Gidel HaMelech Achashverosh et Haman ben Amtata Hagagi, Vayinaseo, Vayasama Kiso, Me'al Kol Hasarim Asher Ito. Right, so Haman is promoted. He's on top of everyone, and I am stressing the word kol, right? Any, all. Okay. Next verse, the chol of de hamelech, etc., and all of the people surrounding him, right? No matter their rank, everyone's bowing to him. But as we also often see with the word u or a vav, vav really means Mordechai in this case, but Mordechai doesn't, right? You all know this story. The only key of reading this inside right now is we're also talking about the kol, right? He's on top of all people. All people are bowing to him, and there's one exception, as I've highlighted in both the Hebrew and the English. Okay, and then they ask Mordechai why he's disobeying. They're waiting to see what would happen, and Haman gets filled with rage. He decides not, we're going to return to this later, but he decides, okay, I'm not going to pick on just Mordechai. It's going to be about the entire Jewish people, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this is the first instance where we're reading about Haman, and we're reading about how he is kol, all, and there's one exception, which is Mordechai. And then in chapter 5, Haman's invited to Esther's first party, and he's talking to his family. What do we see? Also, he's happy. I'm going to look just at the English other than when we need the Hebrew word. He's happy, he's lighthearted, but what happens the second he sees Mordechai, right? His mood is ruined. He goes home to his friends and family to discuss it. Now, I added the numbers here that you see just to show how much Haman, in theory, was happy with and could have been happy and could have focused on, right? So he's talking, he's bragging, we could say, about his wealth, about how many sons he has, about how the king promoted him above everyone. What's more, Esther gave a feast, and it's only the two of us that were invited today. Tomorrow I'm also invited, etc., right? So he's listing what? At least 5 things that are amazing. And then he says, and maybe this kol is also significant, but v'chol zeh, we're talking about all these things, and then he says, yet all this means nothing to me every time I see Mordechai sitting in the palace gate. And I think you're already with me. We'll get back to Breshit. But what are we describing? We're describing someone who has so many things that he can be grateful for, and this one thing mucks it up, right? He could choose to focus on the long list of things he said and everyone who was bowing to him, or he could choose to focus on the one exception. So we're going to go back to Bereshit, and we're going to find some familiar words. What happens? Before we sin, right, we have to have something created as a sin. God has to tell us what we can and can't do. Vayetzav Hashem Elokim al Adam lemor mikol etz hagan achol tochal, right? From every tree, the same word kol, right? We had everything, as we know, it was the full buffet menu. They didn't even have, the laws of meat and milk yet, right? Everyone could eat everything all the time. There was one exception, right? The only thing that we were asked not to eat. And it's after this that we have the reference that the Gemara made to Haman. And so we already indicated most of the significance of this point. What are we saying, right? We're telling 2 stories of ingratitude. Story number 1, Haman, who has so much to be grateful for. And we have Kol, he's above everyone in position, and everyone is bound to him with one exception. And what does he focus on? He focuses on the exception. And then in the original story, in Gan Eden, we are given kol, we're given everything that we want to eat, but with one exception. And what do? We focus on the exception, right? We're not grateful for what we have. We turn to those things the only thing that we're not given. And so, that is, I think, and I've heard the deeper meaning of the connection between these two stories. And that is level one. We're going to be able to dig a tiny drop deeper in the remaining time we have. But I mean, right away, it's mind blowing, because what are the consequences from what we're talking about, right? If we understand the sin of eating from Eitz Hadat as a sin primarily rooted in ingratitude, then ingratitude is what got us kicked out of Eden, right? We would have been in Gan Eden. What ruined it? Ingratitude. Don't blame the Nachash, right? It is ingratitude. That's the key to this teaching. And by the way, Chazal debate whether death would have even, we talked about death before in Tov Ma'od, right? There's a view in Chazal that had we remained in Gan Eden, we would have lived forever, right? So it's not Eden. Maybe it's why we have death. It's not a good thing, right? Ingratitude, result number one in our Bereshit story, is what caused us to lose everything important. What caused us to lose, the plan A for creation. And in Haman's story, it's what leads to right? It's what leads to not just the potential of death in the abstract, according to that one view, right? This is what gets him hoisted on his own petard. This is what causes Haman to suffer, ironically, the exact fate what he wanted to do to Mordechai happens to him. And in both cases, the driving force behind it is ingratitude. Because Purim's around the corner, I just want to go slightly deeper, and in the time we have, add another thought or two, not only about the text of the Megillah, but also things that, as per my want, I hope add dimensionality to the idea of gratitude and help us, in a more fundamental way to appreciate it and to recognize some of the things that sometimes go with it. So, the screen does not seem bright enough. Can everyone see the screen? Okay. I made it brighter. Hope that's even more clear. So Haman has this powerful line, which is also very self-aware, right? We talked about it before. We focused on the word kolza at the time. All of this means nothing to me. But there's something else that's interesting in this phrase, if you want to note a literary move that Esther does that's brilliant. Right? He uses the word einena shoveh li, right? This means nothing to me. Now let's look what happens when Esther is revealing who the bad guy is. When finally, after the king begging her, tell me what you want, tell me what's going on, she says, ki nimkarnu ani v'ami lashmid, etc., etc. And, had it only been that we would be slaves, I would have been quiet. Ki ein hatsar shoveh b'nezek hamelach, right? We have this same word, shoveh, about worth. And we know from the pasuk right after that tsar is a phrase that's used to refer to Haman. So what is she saying? I write it below, right? She is saying that, you know what? First of all, as Haman himself realized, right? If you're unappreciative, you could have everything and still have nothing. But she's throwing in a dig at Haman, right? She is saying, you know what? Haman himself is worthless. He's not worth talking about. He's a trifle, is how people understand the phrase with Tsar above. And his only importance is what? He's indirectly important because of what he wants to do to the Jewish people. So anyway, this is just added literary vort and nuance where Haman had recognized that because of my ingratitude, right, value is subjective. Because of my seething hatred of Mordechai, right, I'm not valuing all the good that I have. And Esther, right, it's not worth much, all the good that I have. And Esther does this brilliant play on words. So for those who enjoy literary aspects of Tanakh, right, there's this added dig that she's calling Haman worthless, right? Great great, knockout line, great rank out, etc. But I want to go deeper. I want to talk about the king. Until now, we have focused on comparing us in Gan Eden to Haman for all the reasons that we don't need to repeat, right? And what we said is in both instances, there was remarkable ingratitude. So now we're going to talk about the king, and we're going to go to the start of the Megillah. And I'm reading select verses, right, to show all that the king had to be grateful for, right? He rules over 127 provinces. He has everyone showing up at the party. It's going on for 180 days. He's displaying riches, including possibly things, according to Chazal, from our Beit HaMikdash. But either way, on the simple level, he's displaying linen and gold and silver everywhere you look, right? This is, what was it? Cribs, right? Cribs, or the original Robin Leach, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. This man has things pretty good, right? Wine is being served in abundance. This is an all you could eat, all you could drink type of scenario. And obviously there's the money behind it. There is also the idea foreshadowing what happens, ein ones, no restrictions, right? He doesn't want to be told no. No one wants that exception you're going to get. But either way, what have we seen? He rules over everything. He's having like a party the likes of which no one has had, both in length and in the caliber of what he's able to show off.
Oh, what time?
I'm sorry? Anyway, the king has it all. And interestingly enough, he might have it all because of his wife, right? There are traditions that she was the one connected to royalty and he married into it, whether he was a stable hand or otherwise. So he is living the life of Riley. I'm mixing metaphors right and left, right? But he has it all. We've gone Cribs, Robin Leach. He has everything going on. And then what happens? She says no. She doesn't want to come when she's asked to come in front of him. And it's eerily parallel, different words are used. Mordechai, it doesn't say he refused, right? But it's eerily parallel to what happens where everyone is doing Haman's bidding, and the one exception is Mordechai, right? Everyone is there with the king, the same Kol idea. All the things are there, all the people are there, everything's going his way. There is one exception. And there's one fly in the ointment, as I wrote here. But here's what I think is interesting and we could extrapolate from that helps us more. What is the psychology? I'm not going to talk in this class about why people are ungrateful. But I think even as people are being ungrateful, right, you sort of know deep down that, this isn't a good look, right? So what is potentially the psychology that lets you have so many good things going for you and have you focus on the bad? This is just a suggestion that I think is borne out specifically in the Megillah, and it's in different ways with both Achashverosh and Haman, right? And so we have the following interesting story that but if we put it in context, I think it makes it just great. So I hope you love it too, right? So what happens, right? Vashti is not going to come, and then what do we have? Memuchan says, Lo al hamelech levado avta Vashti, right? This wasn't just a slight to you. This wasn't just one person, one time, not coming to you, even if you're the king, right? Translation, we're going to look at this in an exponential way. We're going to make this bigger than it was, because if we don't, it's ridiculous. If we don't, there's a problem. If we don't, this is looking really petty. And so we're going to turn this into a global concern that you generously have for your people in the future, as opposed to you're being upset about something that happened to you, right? So he says, one second, right? There's this danger that women are actually gonna be modern thinking people, right? But no, seriously, so they say there's this danger that other women are not gonna listen to theirs, blah, 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 right? But we have this word, lahavzot, bizayon, embarrassment. And to really see what this means, we're going to jump back from Achashverosh to Haman, right? So, and by the way, they repeat the word bizayon in the very next pasuk. So let's jump back to Haman, right? So what did we have about Haman? We know that Haman, gets mad at Mordechai. And then it says what? Vayivez be'einav l'shloch yad b'Mordechai levado. What does this mean? This is what I'm saying happens even in the cases of ingratitude with someone as self-aware as Haman later proved himself to be, right? When he said, I know I have a good life, but it's not enough. What's happening here, I want to suggest, is with this same word, bizayon, right? Haman's embarrassed by what he's feeling, and therefore he turns it from a slight that one man, Mordechai, is giving to one man, Haman, to a global problem with the Jewish people who will be mefuzar and mefurad, and oh my God, better call ICE, right? These are people who are not integrating into society. So in the case of both Haman, who's literally described as being embarrassed to make it just about Mordechai, and more subtly in the case of Achashverosh, whose advisors come to his rescue and say, oh, I know, you're not worried about, what just happened with Vashti. You're concerned about this global, far-reaching implication of what will happen to marriages in this kingdom, right? You have a situation which is very local and which is very one-to-one in terms of a situation of ingratitude, and one-to-one with the backdrop of all these amazing things, right? Amazing life, and it's only one thing that's going wrong. Like all our stories, like you could eat anything in the garden, all the people bowing, etc. And so what I want to suggest is you notice that psychologically, to sort of solve this problem, and we don't want to solve this problem, just a reminder, pro-gratitude team all the way, right? But sometimes, at least, what could happen is, in order for people to express ingratitude, they need to change the terms in ways that may not be real, but allow them to pursue this uncharitable, ungrateful way of life. So those are my added suggestions to Esther. But now let's go back, right? What we're talking about more globally is we are saying that, gratitude is important. Gratitude makes so many appearances in our Tanakh. And if we look at the stories deeply, there are nuances to each of these cases. The first story we talked about was this idea that's both challenging and relatable, right? Life is not always great. How do we express gratitude even in the face of that? How do we express blessings even in the face of that? And we provided a few suggestions. The second topic that we took up was Shabbat itself. And we suggested, building on Rav Nebenzahl, that Shabbat is a way of balancing the very appropriate and called for idea of being grateful to the amazing world that God gave us, with the fact that we're also should be aware of the fact that God intended us to complete God's work, with the fact that, 6 out of 7 days, we should constantly be working on la'asot and on perfecting all the things that God did. So this idea of gratitude, and not ingratitude in that case, right? But yearning, that's appropriate, but it just needs to be tempered, and especially appropriate when you're building towards good things. In the same way that we might say, "Kinat sofrim tarbeh chachma," right? Envy of scholars produces more scholarships. So that's the second story and the second lens. And then the third story, at its simplest level, which is already pretty good, is a story of what does Haman and the Gan Eden story have to do with each other? Well, simple or not so simple, but really in both cases, despite all the coals, despite kol the fruits in the garden you could eat, despite kol everyone of all stations being both beneath him and bowing to him, there's a choice where you focus on the one thing or person that you don't have. But then we dug potentially a little deeper and said that you have this expression of ingratitude even in the king's behavior, and that both with the king and Haman, you have this word bizayon of embarrassment. And what does that speak to? And we suggested maybe that speaks to the fact that people are smart, and even as they're blinded, there is a sense of embarrassment in the fact that with all the good that has been bestowed upon them, they're going to be ungrateful. And the way that they then distort themselves and continue down the wrong path is, I don't mean to be so judgmental, right? But it's certainly a less enjoyable path. The way they do that is by inflating the numbers, right? Choosing innumeracy, but turning a local incident into, oh no, it's not that I'm mad at Vashti. Here's this thing of global significance. Of course I could get past it. And of course I know what to focus on. And in the case of Haman, it's not just Mordechai as an individual. This reflects a character flaw. This is a terrible guy from a terrible nation. And I only have your best interest, king, at heart, in making sure that we eradicate these type of people from our midst. I hope, and I see, at least Linda's hand up, and I could look for more, but I hope each of these stories adds nuances and dimension to how we understand gratitude and how we understand when things could go right and where and how they might be able to go wrong. And in particular, the Purim messages, I hope they stay with us as we get ready to hear the Megillah and to hear these stories again and to think through these ideas in not only Persia and Medea, but in our own lives. So that concludes my talking a lot. Linda, please.
Thank you. I'm really appreciative of everything you shared with us. The only one I'm less convinced by is Haman. And the reason why is because I'm no scholar, okay? So take that with my comments. It seems that what he had was a lot of materialistic. He was, people were obeying him, but what he didn't have necessarily was earned honor, and which to me would be a much higher value. And so I could see why that would bother him a lot.
Look, it's definitely possible. I think this is the significance of what Chazal had in mind. And also, you know, it's very possible people have different views of Midrash. I know this is not Midrash per se, right? But sometimes it's using something as a jumping point. And I mentioned this when we were talking about Tanakh as a gratitude journal. It's either what's key to the story, possibly, or it's something that we're using as a hook. The Talmudic term sometimes is an asmachta, right? We're using this as a jumping point and putting A on B because it fits enough for us to learn this lesson about gratitude. I personally feel, you know, sometimes I feel like things are stretched. This time I feel it's more key, but absolutely, we all can and should draw our own conclusions. And either way, not lose sight of, okay, whether or not it's Haman, this is something that was in Gan Eden and at the heart of the first sin, right? So leave it there. Yeah. You know, there's a lot for us to take away. Does anyone else?
Yeah.
I can't see everyone at once, so feel free to unmute yourself if there's anyone else who has a hand up or wants to add a comment. And if not, we'll give it one more minute. But I really, this is incredibly meaningful to me to help prepare and to learn together as a group. And I'm just so grateful, pun intended, that we get to do this. This was the second class. Next week, we're going to be doing more examples from the Torah. I don't even know that we'll get to Tanakh. And probably in the final installment, if we keep it to 4 and don't extend it to 5 classes, then what we will do is we will jump back to some examples of brachot and tefillot and karbanot and other things, which I'm not translating now for time, but for anyone who doesn't know, I assure you we'll cover it, right? But sayings of Chazal as well as practices built into Judaism that help us really inculcate our gratitude, grow our gratitude, and grow as people. So thank you so much again. And
thank you. That was fascinating.
Thank you. Have a great Shabbat and Purim.
Thank you.